Welcome back, dear viewers. Thank you so much for staying with us. You're still watching this edition of The Breakfast Show live on Nile TV International. Now it's time for our second topic of discussion. And we're going to be talking about an intriguing book about the seventh continent, Antarctica. And we are most delighted to be joined with the author of this book, Mrs. Doaa Abdel Metaal. And she's a writer and an author as well. First of all, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Good morning. Well, let me first of all ask you the seventh continent, Antarctica, and how it could be related to the current international community. Tell us more about this book. What is it talking about?
Sure. Antarctica. Why talk about Antarctica today? I think, most of us think of Antarctica as far, as isolated, as a frozen continent, as something that really isn't relevant to our day-to-day, and it's barely on the news. But I think what this book seeks to portray is the fact that Antarctica is increasingly relevant for us today. The climate is changing. Part of the Antarctic Peninsula in particular is getting warmer. There are 2 experimental human settlements that have been established on the peninsula. So with global warming, with technological change, etc., the continent is far more accessible, and we can, I think, begin to envisage inhabiting the continent, exploiting its mineral resources, etc. And that book tries to bring this reality to the rest of the international community.
Speaking about the book, your book argues that there will be a battle for Antarctica. Why is that, if you can explain more?
Sure. In fact, few people know, so this is the book for the viewers, few people know that there was a battle for Antarctica. And that battle took place between 1900 and 1940 when several countries laid territorial claims in Antarctica. All of that was resolved with an Antarctic Treaty that was established in 1959 under President Eisenhower. It froze all territorial claims and it dedicated the continent to peace and science. So most of us sitting here today think, oh, well, things are fine down in Antarctica. Not only is it protected by its freezing climate, but it's also protected by this marvelous Antarctic Treaty. Little known is the fact that since the signature of this treaty, the continent has in fact been conquered by scientific research stations established by the parties to the Antarctic Treaty. Little is known about the fact that economic activity in Antarctica is booming, tourism, fishing. Little is known about the fact that we have a lot more information about the mineral resources of the continent. It's extremely mineral rich. There's iron, there are precious metals, rare earths, etc. And little is known about the fact that the climate of Antarctica is changing, in particular of the Antarctic Peninsula, probably not due to global warming, just natural climate variability, but it is a lot warmer than it was before. And in fact, that peninsula has a comparable climate to Greenland, which is currently inhabited, as you know. And therefore, I think that all the factors are uniting for a new battle for the seventh continent.
You think that people will start to have, each one will have can have his eye on this seventh continent? Everyone would think of its resources, as you mentioned right now. So it's going to be the battle of the future, for example. Who will take benefit of all this?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, that question is central to the book. So basically, at the moment, there is a ban on mining in Antarctica that expires in 2048. So a big part of my book starts in 2048, and I start to envisage, well, what the various scenarios that could happen to the continent come that date. I think that a whole bunch of countries could be interested in Antarctica come 2048, when that mining ban is to be revisited.
Like which countries?
Well, right now there are 29 parties to the Antarctic Treaty that have the right to establish scientific research stations and that have a scientific presence in Antarctica. These include Australia, New Zealand, the US, Argentina, Chile, so a lot of the neighboring countries to Antarctica, but a lot of the countries that were involved in the exploration of the continent. but the Asians have also arrived in force. The Chinese are building their 5th station in the continent. The Koreans have a number of stations, India, and so on. And in fact, Turkey just arrived to Antarctica on a scientific expedition this year and has announced its intention to establish a scientific research station. So I think the battle is brewing. There are a lot of countries that are there. The continent is mineral rich. Who will be interested? All those in search of minerals, all those in search of living space. And this is key for us to remember that contrary to the Arctic, the Antarctic is a landmass. And therefore, you know, in a world where global warming will impact many different countries, where various island states will be underwater, like Fiji, the Maldives, etc., the search for living space.
You have been there,
certainly,
right?
Yes,
because we can see your picture. Sorry for interruption, but just it attracted my eye. We can see it right now on the stage, on the screen, actually.
That's
so tell us more about your experience over there.
So getting to Antarctica is not as complex as it used to be before. I went on a National Geographic expedition on a very large ice-breaking vessel. So the trip was safe. It didn't take that long to reach Antarctica from the southern tip of South America. Once you get to Antarctica, you're struck by the silence of the continent. You're struck by the fact that it's monochrome, it's black and white. It's this huge, massive ice. So, you know, a lot of white, but also a lot of black because of the Southern Ocean, which is black. The penguins are black and white. The seals are either white or black. And so it's just, you know, it's a combination of very different sensations, I would say. But it is extraordinary to get there because you realize that there's this huge landmass that lies at the end of our planet and that is by and large unexploited.
So why do you think it's still unexploited? I mean, in regards to people living on this continent, occupying it.
Right. Well, first of all, Antarctica has no indigenous inhabitants. So unlike the Arctic, there are no indigenous people who live there. And therefore, the continent has no voice. And that's part of the problem that I discuss in my book. That there's a lot of environmental destruction taking place in Antarctica, but nobody is there to talk about it. The reason it's not, the reason its exploitation has been slowed, let's say, until today is because of the Antarctic Treaty that was signed in 1959. That prohibited economic activity, that prohibited, let's say, that prohibited in some ways the exploitation of the continent. But as I said, the ban on the development of the mineral exactly expires in 2048.
So the point is that we discovered something, a spot on Earth that has a lot of things to provide, many different resources. So these countries, they want to keep these resources till they think how are they going to use it in order not to be exploited by others.
Exactly.
Can we put it like this?
Exactly. And part of the challenge is that the parties to the Antarctic Treaty are few in number. Only 29 countries have decision-making power within the major powers. But there's the rest of the United Nations, which is saying Antarctica is part of the common heritage of mankind. It belongs to the entire universe. It can't only belong to the countries that have built this exclusive club known as the Antarctic Treaty. And that will be part of the complexity of the forthcoming battle. And I discuss that in my book, and therefore I search for a new model of governance for Antarctica. So the book asks, well, come 2048, if somebody starts to look for minerals, what will happen? How can we divide up the continent? And the book is really a proposal for how to divide up Antarctica.
So another question, how do you think, is it different, the Arctic from Antarctica?
The Arctic is very different from the Antarctic. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by countries, and the Antarctic is a continent surrounded by water. So they're opposites. They're very similar in the sense that they are both climate extremes. They're the two coldest parts of our planet, but they are also the two parts of our planet that are warming the fastest. So they share that in common. The Arctic, however, is warming faster than the Antarctic. And therefore, in the second part of my book, I traveled to the Arctic to search for the future of Antarctica, for clues as to what will happen to Antarctica. Economic development in the Arctic is booming because a large part of the Arctic Ocean is now melting. And in fact, it's becoming navigable. So the indigenous people of the Arctic, and that's also another big difference, that the Arctic has indigenous people. There are 1.5 million indigenous people living within the Arctic Circle, and in total 4 million people living within the Arctic Circle. 2 million of them are Russian. Currently in the Arctic, all the people who live in the Arctic Circle are witnessing this opening of the Arctic Ocean with tremendous excitement, looking at all the economic opportunity that it could bring. And I think that the future of Antarctica will very much be similar to the Arctic.
You think that it might happen that one day you can people who would like to move over there to explore, to live, and do you think they might there might be a fear for example, natural disasters, because as we all know, the climate change and the global warming, definitely nothing is guaranteed.
Well, in terms of people being willing to inhabit Antarctica, there, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are 2 experimental human settlements that have been built on the Antarctic peninsula or close to it by Argentina and Chile. And this was at a time when both countries were still ruled by military governments who sent pregnant women on planes to Antarctica to create the first Antarctic communities. And it was their way of laying claim to part of Antarctica and to have the birth and to be part of the birth of the first Antarctic citizens, if you will. How are these communities surviving? They're doing quite well. So I've interviewed some of them for the book. And, you know, they describe their life.
So it has its own population, but few.
Those 2 settlements have their own population. They're about 200, 300 people, let's say.
All in all.
In those civilian settlements. But in Antarctica, in the scientific research stations, there are people who live in Antarctica for the Antarctic summer. And there is a very big research station that works all year round, which is the U.S. research station, McMurdo, that has over 1,000 people who live there. What about the service
and all other facilities they might need?
It is complicated, but we're getting better at living in Antarctica. So some of the newest research stations don't need energy. They don't need non-renewable sources of energy. They now survive on renewable energy, wind. Antarctica is the world's windiest continent, so wind power is now being harnessed to allow for life in Antarctica. In addition, food is now being grown in greenhouses on the continent. So really, the future is here. My biggest fear in the book is that if we don't start to organize life in Antarctica, it will start in a disorganized fashion. All it will take would be for India, China, some other country to decide to build an even bigger civilian settlement in Antarctica. And who is to say, you know, whether that would be allowed, won't be allowed. In fact, life in Antarctica is not regulated by the Antarctic Treaty. The treaty simply stopped the militarization of the continent and dedicated it to peace and science. But it says nothing on whether we can inhabit the continent. And this will happen, and we need to prepare for it.
And do you foresee that when the treaty expires, it's not going to be renewed automatically, and some other wills might surface?
I think that if we don't start planning for 2048, we're in for some pretty bad surprises. In fact, we could be in for some of those surprises even before 2048 if somebody starts to dig for minerals, if somebody violates the mining ban, because remember, that mining ban applies only to parties to the Antarctic Treaty, and only 29 of them are decision makers. So what happens if a country that's not party to the treaty system arrives in Antarctica and starts extracting minerals? What happens if a country that's not party to the system arrives in Antarctica and builds an even bigger civilian settlement than the Argentine and the Chilean that I just spoke about? So all of these are risks.
but also talking about the challenges that this continent is facing as well, just as you mentioned, because it's quite interesting for sure. Just as we mentioned, everyone is trying to find something for his own interest, even if I cannot find it now. So let's keep this treaty. When I start to think or to find time for this, it's going to be mine at the end. But what if we have, it's not a place with nationalities or citizens, it's going to be a place for people from across the globe, without rules, without law. You know, even if you mentioned we have some inhabitants, what about the children? Do they go to school? Do they study? What rules they are following?
In fact, what I discuss in my book is the need to find a solution for Antarctica that would allow people to live there, and that would allow economic exploitation to go forward, but that would combine sovereignty with the right of the entire world to exploit the resources of the continent. So I tried to look for a political model for Antarctica that would allow us to confirm the sovereign territorial claims that have been laid, whilst allowing the entire global community to benefit from the resources of the continent. And so I tried to reconcile, in fact, the interest that the entire world has and deserves to have in the continent, with the fact that some people arrived there first and laid a territorial claim. And the reason I do that is precisely to answer the question you raised, which is that we need rules in Antarctica. We need somebody to look after the continent, and only by confirming the sovereignty of the territorial claimants will somebody begin to look after the continent, and will there be a set of laws that will apply to education, as you mentioned, to transportation, to all the aspects of our lives that need regulation and that will begin to emerge in Antarctica. And I found that model up in the Arctic, a small set of islands called Svalbard, which belong to Norway, but to which any citizen of the world can move, live. So in Svalbard, I as an Egyptian, not a Norwegian citizen, I can travel to Svalbard, I can live there, I can exploit the economic resources of those islands on a par with any Norwegian citizen. And that's what I propose for Antarctica. For example, where Australia has claimed part of the continent, I say, let's confirm Australian sovereignty, but let's allow the rest of humanity to move there under Australian law, but exploit the economic resources of that section of Antarctica on a par with other Australians. So that's how I try to reconcile universal interest in Antarctica with sovereign territorial claims.
Brilliant idea. As Mrs. Doaa, as we're wrapping this interview up, anything that you'd like to tell our viewers about Antarctica that they don't know, a message you'd like to send?
Well, I think it's really the message that I tried to send by writing this book. Keep Antarctica on your radar screens. Don't forget about this continent. It is a continent without an indigenous population. It is not a continent that's visited regularly by journalists because it's far, it's costly, it's difficult to get there. But we can't afford to forget about this continent because it will be on the international negotiating table sooner than we think.
Mrs. Doaa Metaal, author of the book and also a writer. Thank you so much for being with us on The Breakfast Show.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you. Dear viewers, a short break and we'll be back to resume The Breakfast Show, so stay tuned.